A woman in Australia left her home and disappeared without a trace, leaving her husband and 2 children behind. Relatives tried to contact her, but after several weeks of unsuccessful attempts, they decided to turn to the police. An investigation was conducted, and it was concluded that the woman was not in danger and had the right to control her own fate. Since then, she has not contacted her family. Only 40 years later did they learn the shocking truth. Welcome to A to Z Crime Stories. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. Lynette Joy Dawson was born on May 5, 1948 in the Australian state of New South Wales. She grew up in a large, loving family with 2 brothers and a sister. Together with her parents, they lived in the small town of Clovelly, which is essentially a suburb of Sydney. Lynette was a cheerful child, had many friends, and always tried to help her loved ones. Her parents decided to send her to Sydney Girls High School, believing it would be the best choice for her. The school often held events in conjunction with Sydney Boys High School, and in 1965, at one of these events, Lynette met a boy named Chris Dawson. They were both 16 years old, and soon the couple began dating. After finishing school, Lynette decided to pursue a career in medicine. She wanted to help people, so she chose to become a nurse. At the same time, she took a part-time job at a childcare center. When Chris and Lynette were 21, they decided to get married. The couple got married in 1970. The newlyweds moved to the northern suburb of Sydney called Bayview, where the woman got a job at a local hospital. Chris was actively involved in sports and played professional rugby since 1972. He had a twin brother named Paul, with whom they were in the same sports team. Later, they both decided to end their professional careers and became physical education coaches at one of the Sydney schools. Chris and Lynette dreamed of a large family, but they struggled to conceive for a long time. After 6 years of unsuccessful attempts, they began to consider adopting a child from an orphanage. But Lynette finally became pregnant, and the couple had their first daughter, followed by their second. Lynette and Chris were happy to finally have children. Their family seemed exemplary to friends and acquaintances, but soon the first signs of trouble began to appear in this idyllic picture. Lynette's friends started to notice bruises and injuries on her body periodically. When asked about it, Lynette claimed that it was nothing serious and her friends shouldn't worry about it. Lynette's friends were concerned for her, but they didn't see what was happening as something truly terrible. In those days, domestic violence wasn't considered a serious crime in the eyes of a significant portion of society in Australia. Moreover, everyone who knew Chris considered him a loving husband and caring father who never showed signs of aggression and was a positive person. Therefore, their friends tried not to interfere in their marriage and hoped that the couple would solve their problems. But the relationship between Lynette and Chris only continued to deteriorate. Lynette noticed that her husband had cooled towards her and was worried about the future of their family. A few years after the birth of their daughters, they decided to use the services of a nanny. Chris suggested this job to one of his 15-year-old school students, Bev McNally, but she didn't stay in this part-time job for long. She witnessed Chris raising his hand to Lynette twice and decided to leave. After this, Chris offered this job to another of his 16-year-old students, Joanne Curtis. After some time, Joanne had problems in her family, and Chris offered her to stay with them for some time so she could spend more time looking after the children until the situation in her family improved. Despite her kindness and desire to help people, Lynette was against this. She was deeply concerned about the problems in their own family and didn't want someone else to be constantly present in their home. However, Chris insisted on it, and in October 1981, Joanne moved in with them. The young woman lived with them for about a month until Lynette discovered that her husband was sleeping with Joanne. It was a real shock for her and another blow to their marriage. She kicked Joanne out of the house but decided not to divorce Chris. Lynette wanted to keep their family together for the sake of their children, and she continued to love her husband despite his actions. Just a few months later, on December 3, 1981, Lynette faced yet another shock. Chris left her a note saying that he was leaving the family. He wrote that he would move to another city with Joanne and asked his wife not to portray him in a bad light to the children. Lynette was devastated by this news, but a few days later, she was surprised again. Chris returned home because Joanne changed her mind about avoiding him in another city and asked to be taken back. Meanwhile, Chris spent New Year's Eve with Joanne, leaving his wife alone with the children. At that time, Joanne moved into Chris's brother's house, which was on the same street. Despite everything that was happening, Lynette wanted to keep their family together no matter what, so she decided to enroll in family therapy. Chris was against this idea, but she managed to convince him. She went to see the specialist right after New Year's, and it seemed that the therapy had a positive effect on their relationship. Chris started to spend more time with his wife and showed a desire to fix everything. On January 8, 1982, Lynette called her mother and told her that the family therapy was going well. They also agreed to meet with her and other relatives at the local beach the next day. Her mother thought that her daughter's speech sounded a bit unclear, as if Lynette was drunk. The woman explained that Chris had prepared some alcoholic drink for her. The next day, the relatives were waiting for Lynette on the beach, but she never showed up. They called her at home, and Chris said that he had driven his wife to the bus stop that morning. She was going to the store to return some clothes that didn't fit. However, she never returned home, and her relatives began to worry. In the evening, Chris called Lynette's mother and told her that his wife had contacted him by phone. She said that because of the problems in their marriage, she had decided to be away from home for a while and gather her thoughts. Her relatives thought that what was happening was strange, as they were aware of the problems that had been building up between the spouses for years. But they still couldn't imagine Lynette leaving her 2 daughters. She loved her children more than anything in the world and never mentioned considering the possibility of going somewhere. Days passed, but Lynette still didn't contact her family, which only added to their worry. On January 12th, Chris reported that Lynette had called their home phone and said that she was okay. Since then, he had spoken to her a few more times and told her relatives that she had been using her bank card. Despite this, her family continued to doubt that Lynette was okay. She didn't know how to drive and didn't take any items that she might need for a living. She even left behind cash that was hidden in case of an emergency. 3 weeks later, Lynette's eldest daughter started first grade, as the school year in Australia begins in January. But Lynette missed this event, which caused even more concern for her relatives. They were practically certain that something bad had happened to her, while Chris said that she continued to regularly call home, and the last such call was at the end of January. Since then, Lynette hadn't been in contact. On February 18th, 6 weeks after Lynette left home, her husband went to the police. He filed a missing person report and expressed suspicion that amid all the problems in their marriage, Lynette could have joined some religious organization or even a cult. Her relatives denied such a possibility, as Lynette was not religious and didn't attend church. The police began a search, but they had absolutely no leads. Lynette's mother and other members of her family were certain that she would never leave home, abandoning her daughters. So they believed that she had been kidnapped or some other tragedy had occurred. Despite this, the police concluded that Lynette had indeed left home, as they had no evidence of the contrary. They tried to find her for some time and then stopped the investigation. Chris posted a message for Lynette in the local newspaper, calling for her to come home. He wrote that he loved her and was eagerly awaiting her call. He also called all of her friends, trying to find any information about his wife's whereabouts. Despite Chris's eagerness to find Lynette, he divorced her a year after her disappearance, and the next year, he married Joanne Curtis, his former student and lover who had moved in with him. On January 10, 1982, a day after Lynette went missing, Joanne became the stepmother of Lynette's daughters, and Chris, not wanting to traumatize the children with the stories of their mother's disappearance, told them that Joanne was their real mother. Lynette's relatives were not happy about what was happening, but they couldn't do anything about it. They stopped relying on the police, as they had long ago stopped investigating due to the complete lack of leads. Moreover, they didn't even try to question all of her relatives and friends, and the case was abandoned almost immediately without a proper investigation. Chris and Joanne moved to Queensland with the children, selling their old house. Chris almost completely cut ties with his former wife's relatives, only occasionally calling her mother. Later, Chris and Joanne had a daughter. 6 years passed, and during that time, Lynette never contacted anyone. This continued until 1990, when something unexpected happened. Chris and Joanne divorced, and soon after that, Joanne contacted Lynette's relatives to pass on shocking information. She said that she had suspected her husband of murdering his ex-wife all this time. According to her, a month before Lynette's disappearance, Chris had talked about hiring a hitman to get rid of her. On the very day she disappeared, he told Joanne that Lynette had left forever and would never return. She also advised the police to search the backyard of the house where Lynette and Chris lived. In 1991, the police questioned Chris. He said that his ex-wife was just trying to tarnish his name and that he had nothing to do with Lynette's disappearance. He admitted that the woman was intentionally doing this to get custody of their daughter after the divorce. At that time, the court was deciding who would have custody of their child, and Chris's arrest would have been beneficial to Joanne. Police seized phones from Chris and his brother, but nothing suspicious was found. So investigators once again abandoned the case, considering Joanne's words dubious. The case remained dormant for another 9 years until 2000, when the police decided to excavate the backyard of Chris's old home. But there was a catch. Due to insufficient funding, they only dug around the pool area. This area was chosen after police talked to the new homeowners. According to them, during the sale, Chris persistently asked if they planned to change anything exactly in this place. The only thing that the police managed to find was a torn pink cardigan. Investigators admitted that it could have belonged to Lynette and contained some evidence, but DNA analysis found no matches with Lynette. A year later, the case was once again brought to attention. This time, the deputy state prosecutor concluded that Lynette was killed by someone she knew. Police resumed the investigation, questioning her friends and relatives, but they failed to find any leads. Only in 2003, 2 years later, investigators publicly announced that they considered Chris a suspect. They wanted to charge him with murder, but it never happened due to the complete lack of evidence. The man could not be convicted, but investigators managed to find many witnesses who reported that Chris and his brother regularly had intimate relationships with their school students. However, no charges were brought on this matter, and as a result, the case stalled again. In 2006, Chris claimed that he saw his wife among the extras of a series filmed in England, but no one could find any evidence to support his words. In 2010, police announced a $100,000 reward for information about Lynette's disappearance, and 4 years later, they doubled the amount. Despite the large number of appeals, this did not bring any results, and they failed to find any reliable leads. In 2015, police dug up a section of Chris's former home, trying to find his wife's body, but they were unsuccessful. The turning point in this case came in 2018 when a podcast about Lynette's disappearance was released and gained massive popularity in Australia. Arguments were presented in favor of Lynette's husband being responsible for her murder. The podcast was listened to by several million people, which led to a wave of public outrage. Australians accused the police of negligence and demanded that the culprit be punished. The podcast author, Hadley Thomas, spoke to Lynette's relatives and tried to find new leads, although he was unable to find any new evidence against Chris. The public outcry was enough to initiate a new investigation. As a result, on December 5th of that year, detectives arrested Chris for the first time on charges of murder. He continued to insist on his innocence and was released on bail before the start of the trial. The trial dragged on for several years. In 2019, he appeared before a judge and claimed that he did not kill his wife and that the trial should have started in 2020. But Chris's lawyers consistently delayed the process. They insisted that due to the widespread coverage of the case in the media, their client had a biased attitude towards him. So they demanded that they abandon the jury and conduct a trial where the judge would make the decision. In May 2022, this demand was approved and the trial finally began. Chris's lawyers insisted that there was not a single piece of evidence against their client, and all the charges were based on societal bias due to the podcast. According to them, the author presented his opinion in such a way that many believed in Chris's guilt and refused to adequately evaluate the situation. Despite the lack of direct evidence on the prosecution side, they built their case on a multitude of indirect factors. Relatives and acquaintances of Lynette who had repeatedly seen signs of abuse on her body testified in court, and Lynette had admitted to them that Chris was responsible. Their neighbors who witnessed the man beating her also testified in court. Relatives and acquaintances of Lynette who had repeatedly seen signs of abuse on her body testified in court. Lynette had admitted to them that Chris was responsible. Their neighbors, who witnessed the man beating her, also testified in court. They recounted that the day before Lynette's disappearance, when she returned to family therapy, she had bruises on her neck. One of the key witnesses was Joanne, who revealed that as she grew older, she realized how unhealthy her relationship with Chris was. He became obsessed with her when she was only 15 years old. He would leave notes in her backpack at school and ask her out. On days he was persistent and didn't take no for an answer, so the young woman felt like she had nowhere to turn. According to Joanne, Chris completely controlled her life. He told her what to wear, who to talk to, and what to do. He monitored her every move and couldn't stand it when things didn't go according to his plan. As a result, the woman concluded that the man could have easily killed his wife. According to the prosecution, Chris had wanted to end the marriage for a long time, but he would have lost part of his property and custody of the children in the divorce, so he decided to kill Lynette and stage her disappearance. In addition, he wanted to get rid of her so that she wouldn't interfere with his relationship with Joanne. Chris's lawyers, on the other hand, insisted that Joanne had made all of this up to intentionally slander her ex-husband. They also called several witnesses who claimed to have seen Lynette years after her disappearance. These testimonies became the mainstay of the defense, but there was no evidence to support their claims. The prosecution believed that these testimonies were simply fabricated and that if Lynette was alive, she would have contacted her relatives and daughters over the years. As for the phone calls that Chris allegedly received in the first month of her disappearance, no evidence of their existence could be found. The prosecution argued that the woman was already dead at that time and the man made it all up to convince Lynette's relatives that she was okay. In their view, Chris killed the woman on January 9th, drove her body in an unknown direction, and hid it because the police were negligent in their work. In those years, no proper investigation was conducted, although the killer's motives were always obvious. The trial lasted for 10 weeks, and on August 30th, 2022, the judge found Chris guilty. A few months later, in early December, the sentence was announced, 24 years in prison with the possibility of applying for early release after 18 years of imprisonment. Considering that he will be 92 years old by then, Chris may simply not live to see that time. After the sentence was handed down, Lynette's relatives, including her eldest daughter, spoke. She no longer doubted that her father had killed her mother and said that his actions had destroyed her life. The woman demanded that her father confess where he had hidden Lynette's body so the family could finally bury her. But Chris remained silent and looked at the floor while his daughter spoke. Despite the fact that almost 41 years have passed since Lynette's murder, her relatives still hope to find her remains. Chris, who is now 74 years old, continues to insist on his innocence. But even his own children do not believe him. Thus, one of Australia's most high-profile cases was solved, in large part thanks to a podcast that drew the attention of millions of people to this unjust story. If the police had conducted a proper investigation from the beginning, the killer could have been punished immediately after the crime, not after 4 decades. Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.